All right, here's a comment on Maldoror's Lament by Cosmic Lifeist. He said, I've had some interesting conversations with Mr. 86. I believe that his insights are useful, although I also believe that his conclusions are ultimately false. The idea that drives his pessimism is a fundamentally incorrect one. Needs are not inherently problematic. They can lead to both happiness and suffering. To seek an unbeneficial void is hardly a viable solution for those who live lives that they value. I don't see how annihilation is the only way for this alleged unity. I believe that there are certain ideas of ultimate unity in religions such as Buddhism, but it certainly doesn't say that ending all life is the only way of achieving that. If anything, ending all progress could be terrible if certain interpretations of the nature of time and existence are true. Panpsychist and eternalist concerns come into play here. There's no unity to be found in a void that comes from a perspective that's intrinsically flawed. It isn't necessarily the pessimism that's the problem. The problem is the idea that this view must be universalized due to some inherent potency of the negatives. The negatives, despite their apparent depth, cannot surmount the peaks of a valuable life. The primacy of goodness in times of despair cannot be underestimated. Okay, so the thing I see about this is that there's no argument being made. Like, you're just not making an argument. You're saying that the peaks are greater than the valleys are deep or something like that. If you're talking hedonistically, of course I would disagree. I think the peaks and the valleys define each other, and so they balance out. The atheists would have a different view. They would say that the peaks are nothing, they're trivial, and they only exist because of the valleys. Right? You have to suffer, you have to go into a valley, and then you can climb out some trivial little peak, and then you feel happy for a brief moment, and then you're plunged back into despair and suffering. Now, I don't agree with them, but I don't agree with your view either. At least I don't think I do. You haven't articulated it very clearly. And if you want to make an argument, you're going to have to articulate your views more clearly. Like, you're going to have to say it, explicitly state that you're a hedonist, if that's what you are, like that you value pain negatively and pleasure positively. And then if that's what you actually value, if that's your value theory, and you're arguing that life is good, then you have to argue that there is more pleasure than pain in life. Right? And how are you going to do that? Well, what's the argument going to be? That's what's missing here. The argument. You say this to an atheist, and they'll just say, well, you're just chasing your pink balloon. Okay, and I'm not saying this to be rude or to be mean. I'm saying this because I've had a lot of discussions with Cosmic Lifeist, and this is constructive criticism. Like, what are you trying to do with regards to atheism? Are you going to engage it philosophically? If so, you have to state your theory, your frame in which this discussion takes place. Like, if you agree with their hedonistic frame, their hedonistic value theory, if that's the frame you're both committed to, right, which I'm not, because I'm not a hedonist, but if you're committed to that frame and then you agree with them on that, then within that frame there is a clear argument to be made, for one side or the other. The argument is going to be, does life have more pleasure than pain or more pain than pleasure? All right, so that's the debate. If you want to have an actual debate, you're going to have to engage them on that ground and make that argument. All right, let me just go on. He said this predilection for destruction without justification. And then in parentheses, he said the non-existence of needs isn't one, meaning it isn't a justification. There are no souls in some blissful heaven begging to not exist prior to creation. And that's the end of the parenthesis. And then he said, is incredibly puzzling. So I'm going to read it again without the parenthesis. This predilection for destruction without justification is incredibly puzzling. They have a justification. They have an argument. You may not agree with it, but they're not just saying, let's destroy everything for no reason. Let's just destroy everything because whatever. They're making an argument that life is net negative, that life is bad, right? They're making an argument that life is bad. You have to counter that with an argument that life is good. And you're not doing that. You're just claiming that they have no justification. So you're ignoring their argument. You could disagree with it, but what is the nature of your disagreement? Is it just, well, in my experience, life has more pleasure than pain. I feel that life is better. Well, I don't think that's going to cut it either, right? That's just an appeal to personal experience. So what is the argument, right? Again, I'm not saying this to be rude. I would really like Cosmic Lifeist to put forth his argument, to clearly state it, and not just denigrate the other side's conclusion, but present an argument in favor of a different conclusion. Okay, he said, constructing an impenetrable castle of doomerism in order to end some perceived evil without having any regard for the good is also a folly, and it certainly is vain, for it suggests that whether or not anybody has a deeply cherished existence, they should submit to this arbitrary ideology of misery. But sooner or later, I think that people will realize the flawed nature of AN. I think a lot of this comes from the fact that people can't disentangle their emotional commitment to life. And they've spent their whole lives with this kind of life-affirming propaganda and the notion that life is good. And when somebody challenges it, they don't have an argument, but it just seems wrong because they're committed to the opposing view. But because they have no argument, they don't make an argument. They just repeat the assertion over and over in the way it was presented to them as propaganda, right? I mean, this is one of the things I like about Aarvollism. It is asking a profound question. Is life good, right? This seems like a very important question. And nobody ever asks it, or almost nobody ever asks it, right? People take for granted, of course life is good. Well, what's the argument? In what way is life good? All right, he said, Schopenhauer's words might be relevant here. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Okay. In the end, the self-evident truth of the false nature of universal AN would make itself clear to all those who truly seek it. Well, what's the argument? Because saying it's a self-evident truth isn't an argument, right? Saying, well, I'm right and it's a self-evident truth is not an argument. And lots of things that people take for granted as self-evident are just deeply entrenched assumptions. I mean, at some point it was a self-evident truth that the sun goes around the earth. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, he said, perhaps we have indeed reached an important point in the journey of consciousness. Howbeit, I doubt that it's a good one. The mindless pursuit of superficial pleasures and the utter inability to comprehend the existence of views that aren't the exact same as one's own has created a mirage of utopian doomerism. Wow, that is quite a statement. A mirage of utopian doomerism. I don't even know how doomerism can be utopian. I guess he means that they imagine a utopia after the destruction of life or something. The void is the utopia, I guess. I don't know. Okay, he said, a mirage of utopian doomerism that's neither true nor beneficial. Well, okay, what's the argument that it's not true and not beneficial? He said, I don't mean to gainsay the idea that we need to reduce suffering. Well, I do. I don't believe in reducing suffering. I don't see the point of it. Suffering is part of life. It's just there, Suffering is suffering. There's suffering and then there's pleasure or whatever, right? These are just part of consciousness. I mean, I agree with the Aarvollists. There's no consciousness without suffering. But then, I think it balances out, but I'm also not a hedonist, so I don't see any imperative to reduce suffering or increase pleasure. Okay, he said, but I don't believe that an absence of the negative that comes at the cost of the positives is a price worth paying. Okay, but what's the argument? You can't just say, I don't believe X, when you're in a debate about X. You have to make an argument about X. All right, he said, as things stand, this blatant disregard for the nuances of human experience renders AN to be a malignantly useless view that can potentially cause more harm than good. Good video, as always. Well, thank you. I appreciate your comments, and I'm glad you liked the video, although, I don't know. I mean, we disagree. Our disagreement is more profound than your disagreement with AN. Right? Because you're a hedonist, and it seems, anyway, to me, that your value theory is hedonistic, in which case you and they share a common frame. You have a common framing assumption, right? Whereas I reject that framing assumption. So in a sense, you're closer to Aarvollism than you are to my views, because I reject a very deep assumption that you share with them. Now, if you want to debate them within the frame of that assumption, again, you have to make the argument that life is good by that standard that you both agree on. If you both agree on this hedonistic standard, then you have to make the argument that by this hedonistic standard, life is good, or life can be made to be good, right? If that's your belief. All right, let's go on. All right, StateoftheNihil, on reply to Aarvoll on New Theism, said, there is a difference between saying, number one, P is not true in the context of a theory of truth, and two, P is not true because of a lack of theory of truth, or because of a lack of a theory of truth. Number one implies it is false or indeterminate or some other truth value. Number two implies that it has no truth value at all. Not true, not false, not anything, because the notion of truth value is meaningless. And I said, I don't know what you're referring to. Mathematics is not a theory of truth, it is a formal language. You could say it's a normative theory of reasoning about quantities, and also a method for doing so. And then he said, I won't say that math as a whole is a theory of truth, but it has to assume one way or another. Why does it have to assume one? I don't think so. I mean, it's just a thing that we do. It's like a game. You could say it's a game, right? Does soccer have to assume a theory of truth? It has rules, we can play it, and that's it, right? Now, what you think you're getting out of it might depend on your theory of truth, but the game itself doesn't depend on a theory of truth. The mathematics itself is just mathematics. And then he said, I was also linking this to other discussions I came across about propositions and whether they can be true without a mind. Well, only a mind. No, I mean, there has to be a mind saying, well, is this true without a mind? Right? So I would say propositions are meaningless without a mind because they don't exist without a mind, right? There can't be a proposition without a mind. But, I mean, you could easily confuse yourself with that kind of discussion. All right, here is a comment by Kevin Solway. All right, he's on reply to Aarvoll on New Theism. He said, my view is that God is the all, or everything that exists, and thus it is necessarily the foundation of logical truth, because it is the foundation of all individual things. Logical truths don't exist out there. The moment you perceive the existence of anything at all, including imaginary things, which don't exist, but whatever, logical truth exists right there. A equals A. A thing is itself and not other than itself. This is the basis of all logic. And once there is one and thus two, then maths already exists right there. Yeah, this is just really dumb. This guy is so fucking delusional. He really thinks he's a genius, but he's just an idiot. So I said, if God is the all, then it's a meaningless concept. It's not a foundation. The foundation of a house is not the entire house. It's part of the house. If you had made any effort to actually think about these things, you wouldn't say such nonsense. You're doing cargo cult philosophy, imitating the superficial appearance of philosophy, but without doing the intellectual labor necessary to develop actual knowledge. Right? So philosophy is not something you just do by just saying, oh, God is the all, in a certain type of voice. What the fuck does that mean? God is the all? So you're going to use the word God, which normally refers to some kind of anthropomorphic deity, died on a stick 2,000 years ago or whatever. Or, gave some dude in the, was it Medina? An instruction book for life that he somehow forgot to give to Adam and Eve, right? Anyway, so some sort of dude, and you're going to take that word and you're going to say it really means the all, or everything that exists. That's God. Yeah, this is just so dumb. It's just so fucking stupid. It really irritates me, this kind of bullshit. Anyway, we had this little discussion that trails on, but it's just stupid. I mean, I'm not going to waste time on it. All right. Here is a comment by Hjorth on reply to Aarvoll on New Theism. He said, truth doesn't exist without a judger. He's putting that in quotes, so I guess I said that, or I said something to that effect. Then he says, objective reality exists. So these are two premises, and then a little arrow, which means therefore. And then he said, a divine mind has to exist. So here is his argument. Truth doesn't exist without a judger. Objective reality exists. Therefore, a divine mind has to exist. So I said, nope. Objective reality is not truth. That's the big conflation that you and Aarvoll seem to be making. I made a video response for your comment as well, and it will go up in a day or two. Let's see. Then he said, objective reality is a step above human truth. We are subservient to God, but not to our beliefs about the world. There is a difference. Torin McCabe said, yes, truth doesn't exist without a judger. Truth is a judgment about reality. Judgments are only a part of reality, not the entire thing, and reality can exist without judgments, like it did before humans started making judgments. And I also responded to Hjorth saying they're totally different things. E.g., I could say there is a tree outside my window. That's my favorite example these days, or one of them. And we could judge that statement to be true, but that doesn't mean that reality consists of such statements or that the statement exists independent of the human mind. Right? That's the point. A statement is a statement. It's not reality. A belief is a belief. An idea is an idea. It's not reality. The same applies to the idea of the tree. The representation of the tree in my brain/mind is not the tree itself. And then he said, humans can create coherent models about the world and even make simple simulations. I am just saying that for there to exist an objective reality, there has to be a being beyond our world who dictates what it is. This is such a bizarre assumption. And no, there doesn't have to be. And the being would have to exist inside a bigger reality, right? I mean, like God would have to go to the bathroom and flush the toilet in some bigger reality. Okay, he would have to walk around trees in a bigger reality to have the properties of a being, the properties you're attributing to him. So no, unless by God you just mean objective reality. Okay, but then don't anthropomorphize it and just call it objective reality. And it doesn't consist of representations. It consists of whatever it consists of. And all we can do is think about it view it, reason about it, talk about it through the medium of representations, right? And a good analogy is language. We can talk about all kinds of things in language. That doesn't mean reality consists of language. I can describe the tree outside the window. I can say it's green, it's a deodar cedar, it's, I don't know, what is it, 35 feet tall or something. There's a bird sitting on a branch in it, blah, 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 blah. So I can use language to describe it, right? But the words I'm using are not the tree. You can't cut the words up, put them in a fireplace, and burn them, okay, the way you can with the tree. You can't climb the words the way you can climb the tree, right? They contain information about the tree, but they're not the same as the tree, okay? And the same thing is true of your mental language, your representations inside your mind. They can carry information about the outside world, but they're not the same as the thing in itself. The idea the cat is on the mat is not the fucking cat on the fucking mat, right? I mean, how fucking hard is it to understand this? It shouldn't be that hard. And we don't have to imagine that there's a God out there who is imagining the tree so that the tree can exist. This just does not add a fucking thing to our understanding of it. It just adds an imaginary person, an imaginary mind, okay? All right, so then he says, you may say that mathematics is created by humans, but you may not say that it does not follow something immaterial underpinning the system. I mean, I never said everything was material. I really hate this straw man. Is language based on something immaterial? Is the English language floating out there in some platonic realm before we create it? Anyway, then he says that is the transcendental category of math. Well, what is this transcendental category? What is it? I mean, it's just something brains can do. We can put beans into cups. We can use the beans to count the sheep. Anyway, then he says another transcendental category is causality. Well, I mean, I think what you're talking about are presuppositions of thought, right? That thought has certain presuppositions, like causality. Then he says, which we cannot prove from our sense data. Right. And that doesn't mean that it's God. Okay? It just means that, yeah, it's a presupposition of thought. Our brains construct models in a certain way. Causality is kind of built into the way that our brains work, or the models that they generate. And since we can't get outside of our heads, we can't get outside of using those models, so we can't understand a world without causality. But does that mean that causality out there in the world is the same as the causality of our models? No, it doesn't. We can't either empirically prove the number one. If we take your reasoning to the extreme, we would not be able to come out of solipsism. But obviously you don't agree with that. Well, I mean, I do in a sense. I agree that subjectivity is inescapable. Does that mean we can't have language? Does that mean we can't communicate? Does that mean we can't think? Does that mean we can't figure out what's going on outside there and act in the world? No, in fact, we're going to do those things because that's what the brain does. We're going to communicate because that's what humans do. They communicate. But we just don't have an ultimate guarantee for those things. There's no ultimate foundation for them. There's no magic man in the sky that says, don't worry, guys. That stuff you're doing in your brains, that's correct. But I have a brain and I can't really get outside of it, so I'm stuck with it. And that's the point. Anyway, there's a very long discussion here between Hjorth and Meat Machine. I'm not going to read through all of it. Okay, here's a comment by Annie D. on Summer 2021 Comments A. He said, thanks for including my comment. I didn't mean to project my views onto you. I am aware that your reasons for rejecting E are quite different from mine. Yet I do feel compelled for thanking you, primarily because nobody really seems to make good critiques of it these days. Even though your reasons for disagreeing with it aren't the same as mine, I am still grateful for your insights and the fact that it might lead people to reconsider a potentially dangerous ideology. Thank you, I appreciate that. Bingo Babingo said on Summer Comments A, my comment was hyperbolic. I don't hate language, but I do think people seem to strawman each other on accident and miss the point a lot during debates. It is not just bad faith. People really are irrational. Yeah, they really are irrational and they really are dishonest. All right, on Disucssion, Modernity and the Loss of Purpose, Sacred Hogwash said, heard Meat Machine on a digital Gnosis call-in show the other day. He was pretty entertaining and drunk. And this blithering genius guy sounds a lot like Danny. Well, I don't know who Danny is, but yeah. Meat Machine is often drunk and he is pretty entertaining. Although he can be kind of argumentative. Let's to put it mildly. All right. Let's see. All right, this is by Vessel G. Love on New Theism. He said, nihilism also isn't a consistent worldview. And I've said before that even though you describe yourself as a moral nihilist, you talk about behaviors that have to be encouraged or punished so that society can, on average, work better for you and your descendants. We get into a semantics game here, but even though you wouldn't like it, I don't see why I can't call your prescriptions moral prescriptions, and you also try to give them as objective justification as you can. Regarding the problems of purpose, meaning, morality, knowledge, etc., the pragmatic way to deal with them is to just say we're producing increasingly better but imperfect solutions to an infinite problem. Of course, there's no final solution, and it will probably all be in vain. As our solutions improve, they get more complex and produce even greater chaos elsewhere, and this increasing complexity and chaos will ultimately destroy us. It's like the joke where the president goes to make a coffee, but the button for making coffee is next to the button for nuclear annihilation. It always goes like this. I'm not very educated, but as far as I can understand, all the complexity and order that we like is still just a weird side effect of chaos, and chaos always grows, always wins, and will ultimately obliterate us despite the comfortable niche we are developing. We can't win against the fundamental rules of the universe. But again, a pragmatic, honest mind that doesn't have time for philosophy can just say thinking about transcendence and the abyss isn't helping us neither in the short game nor in the long game. My personal favorites, let's say science, markets, and morality, or social incentives if you prefer not to use the word morality, are our iterative, imperfect solution to an infinite problem. So we're doing the best with what we've got. We have nothing better to do, given the limitations of our core biology, and every other method, including nihilism, just gets us nowhere. When you defend eugenics, I don't think you're being very different, despite your attempts to acknowledge the abyss. A friend used to joke that no one can be consistent in their thinking, and all you have to do to see someone contradicting himself is to let him speak long enough. All right, and then I responded saying, anyone who thinks I have a contradiction in my worldview is welcome to debate me in voice and point out the contradiction to me. Nihilism means different things to different people. To me, it means the awareness that we have no foundation for truth and value. It's awareness of the human condition. It isn't inconsistent. It doesn't make any positive claims or even any negative claims. It's just awareness of something. My worldview isn't nihilism. So I guess I should just expand on this a bit. Like, nihilism is something you go through on the path to a rational worldview. You have to break everything down and then build it back up consciously so that you can be sure that you have conscious control over it, that you own it, that it didn't just get into your head through the back door, right? So basically what you do is you throw all the furniture out of your brain, and eventually you can't throw things out anymore. And then you're in nihilism. You're in a state of nihilism, right? Now, I'm not saying you can actually throw things out of your brain. This is a metaphor. But what you do is you question everything. So you don't really throw them out of your brain, but you raise them into awareness and become doubtful of them. And while you're doing this, you're also developing a theory of the brain, a theory of the mind, right? This is a core... for some reason, this is often not understood, but psychology and philosophy really go hand in hand. You can't really philosophize without psychologizing, or vice versa. If you try to do either without the other, you're kind of, you're probably deceiving yourself. Or you're not going to get very far. So in a sense, nihilism is just really getting that you're a brain and a skull, like fully understanding the implications of that theory of yourself, that psychological theory that everything that's happening in your mind is neurons firing in a blob of jelly inside a skull. And that's it. There's no magic, there's no supernatural communing with, some other realm or some other mind or whatever. All right, I said, you appeal to pragmatism, but there's no way to define pragmatism without values. If an honest mind discovers that his values are just based on intuitions and assumptions, he must grapple with the philosophical problem of value. He can't just be pragmatic, because now he can't just take his values for granted. I mean, by being pragmatic according to his values, he might be being very unpragmatic according to some other values, right? Pragmatism depends on values. And once you become aware that your values are not rational, that opens up the question of, well, what should they be? Are they correct? How did they get into my head? What are values? What are the right values? Right? These are all philosophical questions that an honest thinker is confronted with once he understands that he is a brain and a skull. And, understands that his values are the result of mechanisms in that skull, operating on the data of experience generated by living in a certain kind of world, right? Once you understand that, now you start questioning the values, questioning, is there a rational basis for value? Anyway, then I said, and yes, it is consistent and rational to reject morality, and then in parentheses, belief in objective values and imperatives, while valuing society. I value society from my subjective perspective. You can value it or not from your subjective perspective. The fiction of morality is not necessary for society, and in fact, it is becoming a huge problem for our civilization. And then he said, I was wrong. I wrote 3 long paragraphs to clarify my position, only to finally answer myself that your claim, as far as I understand it, is that these atheists, Dawkins, Harris, Pinker, for example, don't really face the abyss. Instead, they just create their own religion, humanism, to deal with the amoral universe. Your approach is therefore the most honest and the cleanest, because it is not putting any veil on the abyss. Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it, yeah. And yeah, those guys don't stare into the abyss. Okay, and then he said, my disagreement was coming from the fact that I don't think that 20th and 21st century existentialist/atheist philosophers deal much less with nihilism than you do. But if we include the issue of morality, you can truly make the case that you face the abyss way more than they do. Yeah, but there's a lot of good stuff out there. I'm not saying don't read the existentialist philosophers. I think you should read Nausea by Sartre. I think he was very, very smart. The ravens are saying hello. All right, here's a comment by whatgej on New Theism. And he's presenting an argument, and he has labeled his statements with letters. So the first one is A. If moral realism is true, then we ought to be moral. B. If moral realism is false, then we are not obligated to be moral, but there is no harm in being moral. C. There is a chance moral realism is true. D. Belief in moral realism is part of being moral. And E. Therefore, we should believe in moral realism, since there is no moral harm in doing so, but there is a risk of moral harm in not doing so. So this is just Pascal's wager for morality, right? And Pascal's wager is a fallacy. I mean, you just look it up on Wikipedia. It's an appeal to consequences fallacy, but it's also a kind of question-begging fallacy. Okay, anyway, then he said, you may contend D is false. Maybe some satanic or funky version of morality would have us reject moral realism, but this argument would force you back into defending your version of morality. You make a similar argument in this video by using made-up gods to keep a lid on the box of nihilism. This argument doesn't disprove your skepticism, but it does seem to help the moral realist push his morality into the "you're saying there's a chance" category. What do you think? All right, well, I appreciate the comment, so thanks for the comment. Let's see, where did I respond? Okay, down here I said B and C are false. There is great harm in believing in morality. It is the number one threat to our civilization. It prevents us from solving all the major problems of the modern world. There is no chance that moral realism is true. Then I quoted him saying, you make a similar argument in this video by using made-up gods to keep a lid on the box of nihilism. And I said, not sure what you mean. I talked about God being a box that people put philosophical problems into and declare them solved because they're in the box, rather than solving them. I deal with philosophical problems and solve them. So I don't do this. I don't believe in the seven-headed pig, right? I don't say, well, because I believe in a seven-headed pig, the big questions of meaning and purpose and truth, I don't have to think about them. They don't really exist anymore. The seven-headed pig solves those problems for me. Yeah, I mean, I don't do that. The way he worded what he said made it seem like he was saying I was doing that when I was just describing what God is used to do. It's used to dismiss philosophical problems, to hide them, to hide the abyss. Okay, anyway, then I said there seems to be an assumption among the traditionalists that without religion, there is only nihilism. In a sense, that's true. Without delusions, we would have to accept our lack of a foundation. However, that lack of a foundation isn't the end point of philosophy. It's the beginning of constructing a rational worldview. Okay, then there's like a back and forth between me and somebody called Peter Cozen, but it's not really worth reading. It's kind of dumb. Let's see. All right, and then whatgej responded to me. He quoted me saying there is great harm in believing in morality, and then he said, number one, if moral realism is false, there is no harm or good in anything. There are only opinions about good and bad. Why ought I care about harm generated from believing in morality if moral realism is false? The nihilist cannot generate an ought without an appeal to morality. Well, you don't need oughts. You don't need oughts to live your life. You generate your own values, your own value judgments. You don't need to be told what to do, to want something. There are oughts in society, like society says you can't go out there and kill your neighbor. You can't take the groceries out of the grocery store without paying for them. But so there are those oughts in the social environment, but they're not ultimate oughts. They're not extra social or minded, independent or cosmic or logical. But that doesn't mean you don't have values. All right, then he said, number 2, the moral realist has an out against this argument. He can always back out and say, you have the wrong moral standard. For instance, in your example of civilization collapsing, leading to human extinction, the moral realist can admit that belief in morality will lead to extinction, but that extinction is a moral good. Well, I don't think the collapse of civilization is going to lead to extinction. It's just the end of modern civilization. And, the beginning of a very long dark age that we'll probably never climb out of. But, yeah. Not extinction, though. Okay, then he said, anyway, the claim that there is harm in believing in morality is an empirical claim, which also depends on your interpretation of morality. It's a very slippery subject to debate. All right, then he quoted me saying, there is no chance that moral realism is true. And then said, what is your argument for this? You have not disproved moral realism deductively. Well, you have not made an inductive argument for moral realism, right? I mean, we don't believe something just because we can't disprove it deductively. Do we believe anything that we can't disprove deductively? I can't disprove the existence of the 7-headed pig deductively. Does that mean I'm going to believe in it? Does that mean there's a chance that it's true? There's a chance that there's a 7-headed pig living in the center of the sun? No. There really isn't a chance, right? There really isn't. I mean, you could say, well, there's room. There's, philosophical skepticism leaves a little bit of room for doubt there, but not really. Anyway, all right. He said, you may have a better explanation of why people have moral beliefs, i.e., we evolved in an environment where moral beliefs were useful. Well, that's not my explanation, but okay. Anyway, then he said, however, you're always stuck with an argument to the best explanation, and there's a chance your explanation is false. Also, I don't see why you would have 100% confidence in anything. Since we do not perceive reality itself, we only interpret our perceptions of reality. There is a chance our cognitive faculties are misleading us. We're being manipulated by a demon or whatever. If we embrace epistemic humility, we cannot say there is no chance that moral realism is true. Well, actually, you couldn't even say that you can't say that, right? If you really embrace epistemic humility, you just sit there going, blah, 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 blah. I don't know anything. I can't say anything. So we don't embrace epistemic humility to that extent, right? Anyway, I mean, so he's, his criticism is this extremely strong statement that I make. Okay, fine. Anyway, let me just read my response. I said, I quoted him saying, if moral realism is false, there is no harm or good in anything. And I said, if moral realism is false, which it is, then there is no objective/moral good or bad. Something can still be subjectively bad to you or good to you. It is your judgment that makes it bad or good to you. Right? So something is bad for you if you judge it to be bad. Something is good for you if you judge it to be good. It is subjective. But the judgment still exists. It's not like it disappears because it's subjective. It's there, right? And all values are like that. They are subjective. They are judgments. Okay, and then I said, and something can be good or bad to us, some group, if we agree that it is good or bad. E.g., if most people value civilization, then the destruction of civilization is bad to them. It's their collective judgment that makes it good or bad to them. So just as we can judge things as individuals, we can also judge them as collectives. We can agree as a collective that this is bad and that is good, and then that makes it bad or good to us. But it doesn't make it bad or good to the cosmos, or to logic, or to God. Okay, that's the difference there. We can have collective values, but collective values are not objective. Morality is the delusion that collective values are objective, rather than intersubjective. Okay, then I said morality is a cause of consequences that most people would judge to be harmful. That's the sense in which it is harmful. The delusion of morality prevents us from understanding the problems of the modern world and solving them. E.g., most people judge eugenics to be morally bad, but most people don't want modern civilization to collapse and billions of people to die as a result. Without eugenic population control, modern civilization will collapse and billions will die as a result. Right? So people say, well, that would be evil. But then when you point out the consequences, they get cognitive dissonance, because how can what they believe to be good produce something that they view as bad, as harmful to us collectively? And how can something that they view as evil produce consequences that they would view as good? Right? So it's like this, it could be a conflict between a deontological moral intuition and a consequential moral intuition, or utilitarian moral intuition. But anyway, morality is just an ad hoc mess, and so it doesn't really make sense. You can't turn it into a consistent set of axioms. Anyway, and then I quoted him saying he can always back out and say you have the wrong moral standard. And I said he may claim that his moral standard does no harm, in which case he has to define both harm and his moral standard. Right? So if after the fact, when you point out that his moral standard leads to the destruction of civilization, well, then maybe at that point he'll say, oh, well, yeah, well, okay, then I guess it's okay if modern civilization is destroyed. Right? He can sort of back out of it after the fact, but you get him to state up front what he values, and then you show that his morality leads to an outcome that he would negatively value. Anyway, then I said, regardless, that won't help him argue for moral realism. Pascal's wager is an appeal to consequences fallacy. To rationally argue for moral realism, he would have to argue that objective value and imperatives exist in some sense. So the burden of proof is on the moral realist to show that moral realism is a coherent notion and that it explains something, that, there's evidence for it. It has explanatory power. All right, then I quoted him saying, what is your argument for this? And he's asking me what's my argument that moral realism is not true. I said there are many arguments against moral realism. The simplest is that it is an absurd notion. Objective value is an oxymoron. It is conceptually incoherent. So you could actually argue that it can be deductively rejected, although you have to get into the concepts, right? I mean, anyway, I've gone through some of this stuff before, but it doesn't really make sense that there could be objective value that is also subjectively somehow imposed on you. Like, I don't even think it makes sense to talk about value without a subject. So you could argue it's an incoherent notion. It has a kind of conceptual contradiction within it. But anyway, it depends on the definition, right? What does value even mean, right? You have to figure that out. Anyway, then I said I may not be 100% confident in anything, but if I am 99.99% confident, I just round up. I am extremely confident that moral realism is false, and that there is no pink elephant in this room. Yes, philosophical skepticism applies to every claim, but that doesn't mean we can't make claims and feel confident in making them. If you want to discuss/debate in voice, let me know. Text is not the best format for this sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, these long discussions I really don't like to have in YouTube comments because, I mean, it's just not a great format. The comments get deleted, they disappear. You put effort into making an argument and then it just disappears, or it sits there and nobody ever sees it. So I prefer to have discussions in voice or somewhere else, like on Discord is fine. Even Twitter DMs is sometimes better. Anyway, I'm going to also read this comment on the same thread by somebody called Some Bonehead. He said, "You're unhinged. I made the right move leaving your Discord server all those years ago." What a bizarre comment, right? Like I care about this guy leaving my Discord server. Anyway, I said, "You haven't been missed. I have no idea who you are." Why are you making such an asinine comment? Cognitive dissonance. Of course. Your delusions will be destroyed if you expose them to rationality, or at least your faith in those delusions will be destroyed. So you better go somewhere else where your delusions will be safe.